So in the previous video, we left off discussing and talking about that it is a requirement that a person who was a victim of sexual abuse, even from within the religious community, should first of all speak to a rabbi, to see if they would qualify. There was presence what is called raglayim ledavar. There's enough possibility that something did happen. However, if does not meet that level, according to various rabbis, the issue should be not brought to any authorities, but rather keep it within the community. And this is the reason why I started with this whole entire conversation regarding, when to bring it to the authorities and when not. The reason why it becomes a big issue, it's because, according to Jewish law, there is a concept that's called Misirah, which is often used to silence the survivor who otherwise would come forward and tell on the person who did the damage or harm to the authorities, even though it would be civil authority. And thus, the Misirah literally means, it refers to a Moser, one who's turning over a Jew to a non-Jewish court or non-Jewish authority, which is completely prohibited by the Torah. And thus, we find ourselves in a situation like this, where something has to be done. Only in the case where the life of the child is in danger, it must be done. And if it's a repetitive situation where the abuse is continuing on a day-to-day basis. If it happens to be just only a one-time situation, it's easier to handle that situation, bring it to therapy, and deal with the issues at hand on a different level. And thus we find that there is those who basically will take the child for sexual abuse to the authorities and face some very serious backlash, both to the victim as well as to the community, because everything comes back to the community. And one of the things we're going to take a look at is the issue of how many children in the community, the religious Orthodox community, are affected because they have a parent that basically are alcoholics and they're constantly drinking. And usually a lot of these actions of sexual abuse take place when the perpetrator, which I'm going to call him perpetrator, is under the influence of alcohol. I'm going to read this here, which comes from a case study of children of alcoholic foundations, found that 40% of confirmed cases of child mistreatment or child abuse involved alcohol or other drugs. Now, obviously this is a big issue, because these are areas in which the alcoholic is having a repetitive problem with alcohol, and you'll see the abuse is on a continuous basis. But when it has to do with just a one-case situation, there are other remedial situations that can take place. With alcohol, there's also the issue that there is a concept in Judaism that some people just don't remember having done anything wrong. And obviously when the victim goes forward and accuses the parent of child abuse and there's no proof, the issue usually ends there. But there is also the issue of, is the perpetrator an alcoholic? Is the perpetrator have done this before? So a series of questions and litmus tests takes place. In most of the courts and child protective services, they usually will ask and investigate further in the perpetrator to see if there is that tendency or that inclination that they can find a way to connect the victim with the perpetrator. In addition, was there any evidence of any perhaps violence? And all of this takes even on a legal matter where an investigation takes place and the issues are brought forward. The prohibition of Jewish law, Misirah, usually forbids informing on another Jew to a non-Jewish authority, even if the behavior in question violates both Jewish and secular law. The historical condition of this is the prohibition stems from the historical reality that some non-Jewish governments have been perceived as hostile to the Jews, and potentially leading to unjust and excessive punishment. This is where we get the word Moser. Misirah derives from the idea of Moser, and in some interpretations, a Moser can even be considered a rodef, a pursuer, someone who is pursuing another Jew for the intention of murder and harm, and may even be subject to death. In such a case, there are some exceptions for this prohibition, and one of the examples, of course, reporting child abuse or other situation that poses a clear and present danger not only to the child but to the community or the individual generally permitted, and in some case even it may be an obligation to do so. There are some modern applications to this, and in context you need to really make it clear that you are permitted to go forward to the local authorities to do so. This is why it gets complicated. Now, I'm going to pause right here because we're going to get into an area which 40% of the abusers or the violators or the ones that are involved in actually committing child abuse are involved with a practice of alcohol, and the percentage of child abusers usually are involved with alcohol or were in a state of drunkenness. Now, the question that we have, and we're going to raise this question because obviously the perpetrators also usually are accused of this crime of child abuse, and yet the one being accused, the perpetrator, doesn't recall, because the perpetrator happens to be in a state that is not all there. Whether he did it or not, it's not the issue right now at this point. But we're going to look at, in our next video, the issue when the perpetrator is in fact not liable and not conscientiously responsible for the actions that he did, which puts the victim and the perpetrator in a very difficult situation, which even Jewish law brings about what needs to be done in that case. Of course, one thing that Jewish law does not deal with, and that is the agony and the pain and the harm, whether the perpetrator recognizes that he's done harm or not, is still present. And that's something that we'll also discuss in our video following the issues of the perpetrator under the influence of alcohol, whether he remembers, whether he did it, whether he confessed having done it, whether there is some type of psychological test that he can take to bring out the fact that he did it. So there's a series of areas that we have not yet covered, but we want to cover them in some of our next videos. There is no definite statistics on the actual percentage of child abuse who basically, is under the influence of alcohol and is basically done that. It's interesting, this complexity of memory, what they call memory loss or false memory formation, is something that even researchers have realized that exists when a person is under the influence of alcohol and is, as I'm going to call it, as drunk as Lot. And why do I say as drunk as Lot? Because there are some people who have abused their children in a state where they completely blacked out, or they don't even remember not one iota of what took place. According to Jewish law, that is referenced as drunk as Lot. That's exactly the term that's used in halakha regarding this situation, where the halakhic reasoning excusing one that is drunk like Lot brings about a situation even more difficult than not having proof, than not having any. For example, if the child was abused, sexually abused, there's no trace of any male semen on her body or forced violation or anything like that. So we're going to take a look at this issue in our next video regarding the person who violated or basically harmed a child under the influence of alcohol or drugs, or was basically not conscientious that he was doing what he was doing, alleged by the victim. So this becomes a very important point in this series, and we're going to take a look at that, because obviously the area of child sexual abuse also has a side to it that has also been shown that many times the child, for reasons in the home or reasons to try to bring the parents back together, they will falsely accuse the other parent of something they never did. And this is also a dynamic that takes place, psychologically speaking, within such accusations. And this becomes very important. Those of you who go through parental alienation, where you have a very difficult divorce, and one of the parents is charging the other, you've done this, you have done that, and there's no proof of any harm done to the child, and you have this aspect that the child is then manipulated in order to falsely accuse the other parent of having done something that the other parent never did. And the issue of not remembering comes into play with this, because obviously if you didn't do it, you won't remember having it been done. And so this also plays a part in the whole issues between the victim and the perpetrator, and the bottom line of how do we resolve this issue. And this is why I titled the series, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So we're going to continue this topic, and hopefully in the next video we'll be able to tie together several issues that comes to light and brings to light the issue of the perpetrator this time. We've talked about the victim. And the victims usually brings most of the attention. There's a lot of laws on the books that protects the victims, that protects even an accusation from the victim more so than the perpetrator or the accused. So we'll take a look at that in our next video.